In 1959, Hawaii joined the United States of America as the 50th state in the Union. However, in a different timeline, the Kingdom of Hawaii would today be an independent member of the United Nations. So how did it go from being a prosperous, independent country to being a US colony before eventually becoming a US federal state? Hello and welcome. If you're new, my name is James Ker-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, and the origins of countries. While many of the world's states came into existence within fixed and defined borders that they've retained until today, many others reach their current boundaries through a process of territorial acquisition and conquest. The United States is one of the most interesting such cases. The growth from the original 13 colonies that became independent in the late 18th century to the USA we know today, made up of 50 states with potentially 2 more on the horizon, is a fascinating story. While many may be broadly familiar with the expansion across continental America and the consequences this had on Native American populations, and even the purchase of Alaska from Imperial Russia, far fewer are aware of the story of Hawaii's integration into the Union. Indeed, it's perhaps the most interesting of all the states, not least of all because it's a tragic story of how what once had been a prosperous and truly independent country fell victim to that rarely discussed feature of modern international politics, US colonialism. So, how did Hawaii lose its independence and become a part of the United States? Hawaii lies in the Pacific Ocean, approximately 2,500 miles or 4,000 kilometres from the mainland United States. Japan lies 4,100 miles or 6,500 kilometres to its west, and the closest independent state is Kiribati, lying approximately 1,100 miles south. Consisting of 8 main islands and many smaller islands, atolls and reefs, it's approximately 6,400 square miles or 16,000 square kilometres, making it the 47th largest of the 50 states. According to data from the US Census Bureau, its population currently stands at around 1.4 million, making it the 39th most populous state. The largest ethnic group are Asian, of mainly Chinese and Japanese descent, who make up around 40% of the population. White Americans account for a quarter of the population, and 11% are Latino or Hispanic. Just 10% now claim native Hawaiian heritage. While it's unclear exactly when the first humans arrived, best estimates put the arrival of Polynesians on the island at somewhere in the middle of the first millennium. Over the next 1,000 years, they established a sophisticated and structured society. However, for our purposes, the story really begins in 1778, when the British explorer Captain James Cook became the first European to visit Hawaii, which he named the Sandwich Islands. At the time, the islands were divided between different chiefdoms, but soon after Cook's visit, a process of unification began under the leadership of King Kamehameha. In 1792, another British expedition arrived and was welcomed by the king, who gladly accepted British support and weapons in his battle for control. By 1810, the campaign to unite the islands had been completed and Hawaii became a single independent state. In the years that followed, the king and his successor, recognising their precarious position internationally in an age of imperial expansion, sought to bring the islands under British protection. But while Britain agreed to defend the kingdom's sovereignty, it saw no need to go any further and make them a formal protectorate or even colony. As far as London was concerned, the existence of such a friendly leadership meant that it merely needed to make sure that no other power exerted greater influence. This was confirmed on the 28th of November 1843, when Britain and France, the 2 great imperial powers of the day, issued a joint declaration recognising the Sandwich Islands, or the Hawaiian Islands as they were known internally, as an independent state, and agreeing not to try to take direct or indirect possession of the islands. This independence was also formally recognised by the United States the following year. And yet, by the end of the century, that independence would be lost. So what happened? First of all, it was down to a complex series of political, economic and demographic changes. In the 1820s, Christian missionaries began to arrive from America and soon established themselves as important figures, including within the government. Meanwhile, as the islands became increasingly prosperous from trade, more and more Europeans and Americans arrived. As well as taking control of business, including the emerging sugar industry, the diseases that they brought with them decimated the native Hawaiian population. On top of this, there was an important geopolitical dimension. As the United States expanded to taking California on the west coast, the Pacific Ocean, with Hawaii sitting right in the middle, now assumed a central place in US external ambitions. The series of events leading to the end of Hawaii's independence can be traced back to 1848, when, following a dispute over trade and the subjugation of Catholicism, a French admiral briefly invaded and sacked Honolulu, the capital of Hawaii. After Britain rejected a request to make the islands a protectorate, arguing that this would be a violation of its agreement with France, Hawaii instead placed itself under US protection in 1851. In the 2 decades that followed, the economic and political influence of the United States and individual Americans continued to grow. However, the decisive moment came in 1875 when the United States and Hawaii signed the Treaty of Reciprocity. Amongst other things, this lifted tariffs on sugar imports. The resulting explosive growth in trade not only led to a massive influx of workers from China and Japan, thus further changing the demographics on the island, it also brought enormous wealth and influence to the American-run companies that controlled the sugar industry. In 1887, they forced through a new constitution stripping power from the monarchy and effectively putting it in the hands of the kingdom's white elite. Meanwhile, Hawaii's importance to the United States continued to grow. In November 1887, the United States and Hawaii ratified an extension to the Treaty of Reciprocity that granted the US exclusive access to a port on the island of Oahu at a place called Pearl Harbor. The final phase in Hawaii's independent existence began in 1891 when King Kalakaua died and was succeeded by his sister, Queen Liliuokalani. Much to the anger of the white business elites, she tried to restore power to the monarch and native Hawaiians. In January 1893, they deposed the Queen in a coup launched in collusion with the US minister on the islands and carried out with the support of a detachment of US Marines. While the kingdom was replaced by the Republic of Hawaii, there was never any doubt that the aim of the island's new leadership was to pursue annexation. As they saw it, the only way to strengthen the economy and protect the islands against the growing power of other countries, including Japan, was to become a full part of the United States. However, at this stage, the United States opposed annexation. A report produced by the US Special Commissioner to the islands, James Blount, openly stated that the monarch had been illegally overthrown and that the undoubted sentiment of the people is for the Queen, against a provisional government, and against annexation. Crucially, the idea was also strongly rejected by the US President Grover Cleveland, who came to office shortly after the coup. As he bluntly put it, by an act of war committed with the participation of a diplomatic representative of the United States and without authority of Congress, the government of a feeble but friendly and confiding people has been overthrown. But all this changed in 1897 when William McKinley assumed the presidency. Spurred on by a tide of US nationalism during the Spanish-American War, he moved to take control of Hawaii. Despite opposition from the native islanders who gathered a petition against union, on the 12th of August 1898, the United States formally annexed Hawaii. A little over a year and a half later, in April 1900, the US Congress officially established the territory of Hawaii. Almost from the start, there were calls for Hawaii to be formally incorporated into the Union. The first of these came in August 1903 with a joint resolution of the legislature of the territory of Hawaii. However, this went ignored by the US Congress. So too did numerous other calls for statehood in the years that followed. Even Hawaii's strategically vital role, exemplified by the naval base at Pearl Harbor, which became the headquarters of the US Pacific Fleet and would achieve worldwide fame when it was attacked by Japan on the 7th of December 1941, did little to shift opinion. It was not until after the war that things finally started to change. In part, it was down to a growing domestic impetus to reconsider Hawaii's position, spurred by its role in the war and by the fact that it was economically prosperous. But there was also an external dimension. Under Chapter 11 of the Charter of the newly established United Nations, member states had to provide a list of all the territories they were responsible for administering, whose peoples had not yet attained a full measure of self-government. In other words, a list of colonial and quasi-colonial holdings. On the 9th of February 1946, the General Assembly passed Resolution 66-1 on non-self-governing peoples, which listed over 70 non-self-governing territories around the world, including 7 under US control: Alaska, American Samoa, Guam, Hawaii, the Panama Canal Zone, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. Unlike the others, Hawaii and Alaska were defined as incorporated territories of the United States. This meant that the Constitution applied in its entirety and that their status couldn't be reversed. To this end, granting them full statehood became an obvious answer. Nevertheless, the idea still had its opponents. Within Hawaii, many native Hawaiians still opposed the annexation 60 years earlier and argued that the islands were not being given a true right of self-determination, including the option of regained independence. Meanwhile, in the United States, there were those who believed that the islands, with their predominantly Asian and non-white population, had no place in the Union. Finally, party politics also played a part. President Eisenhower, a Republican who strongly favoured Hawaii's admission, opposed Alaska's bid for statehood on the grounds that its population was too small and that statehood would limit the US military's ability to use the territory for defence purposes. However, the Democratic-controlled Congress opposed the admission of Republican-leaning Hawaii, and less Democratic-leaning Alaska joined as well. In the end, a compromise was reached. On the 3rd of January 1959, Alaska was admitted to the Union, thus opening the way for Hawaii to follow. On the 11th of March 1959, an act to provide for the admission of the state of Hawaii into the Union was presented to the Senate, where it passed by 76 votes to 15. The next day, it was passed by the House by 323 votes to 89. Less than a week later, on the 18th of March, it was signed into law by President Eisenhower. The final stage came a little over 2 months later, when a referendum was held on statehood. The final result was overwhelming. On a turnout of over 90% of the island's 155,000 registered voters, a little under 133,000 voted in favour and just under 8,000 against. On the 21st of August 1959, Hawaii officially became the 50th state of the United States. The incorporation of Hawaii into the United States is a fascinating but tragic story that sets it apart in many ways from the admission of the other 49 states. In the course of half a century, it went from being a prosperous, independent kingdom acknowledged by the leading powers of the day to being a US colony, a process driven by a small elite who completely overrode the wishes of the native islanders. And while annexation was at first opposed by the United States, it was eventually accepted by an administration gripped by notions of imperial grandeur. That said, and to its credit, the United States has in fact acknowledged the inherent injustice of those events. In 1993, to mark the centenary of the coup, the US Congress passed a joint resolution apologising to native Hawaiians on behalf of the people of the United States for the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii with the participation of US officials, an act that deprived them of their right to self-determination. And yet, a little over half a century after it was deprived of its independence, Hawaii went on to join the Union as a full and equal federal state. In this sense, Hawaii today enjoys a status still denied to the other territories acquired at the same time, most notably Puerto Rico. Nevertheless, despite its current standing, one can't help but wonder what might have happened to Hawaii had it remained an independent kingdom. I hope you found that interesting. If so, here's another video that you might like. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.